Okay, folks, welcome to the second in our video series for our Introduction to Programming course using the GROK Learning online Python course. And this time we're going to be starting to actually do some programming this time and using Module 1 and the problems in Module 1, which is called Talking to Your Computer. So we're going to need to remember what we spoke about just earlier about variables in our previous video, that every programming language has their own way of keep remembering the input that your program needs to use, that we get our input often from our user, but maybe from other places, and we store that input in variables. You might remember we talked about the analogy of baking a cake, and the ingredients are the inputs to the cake, and we store them in the mixing bowl, but we need a place to store our inputs for our program, and we do that in variables. So there's a few things we need to know about variables, and they can change across different programming languages, but generally all your variable names, we need to remember that one of the things is that when we name them, the name we give them really should reflect the purpose of the variable. So we should think about what type of data is being stored in there and what's going to go there, and name it accordingly so that the name we give it makes some sense. We also have some rules about the characters we're allowed to use. So we have to start our variable names either with a letter or we can use the underscore character, but nothing else. Then we have to start our variable names with one of those options. Our variable names can have letters in them, but they can also have numbers. They can't have numbers at the start though. You have to remember that because we have to start with a letter or an underscore, and we can also use the underscore character. No other characters. These things apply to the Python programming language that we're going to use, but other programming languages have some similar requirements. And we also can't use any words that are reserved by the programming language you're working with for particular commands. For instance, most programming languages would have a command called else as a part of the language, so we can't use that for the name of a variable. So we need to be aware of those things for the names that we use. Something else to be aware of, sometimes you might want to use multiple words to describe your variable, name your variable, and there's different ways that we can use that. We can use multiple words, but notice spaces are one of the characters that aren't allowed. You can't have a variable name with spaces in it. So one of the techniques programmers often use, sometimes they just use all lowercase letters to represent their variable names, or they might use run multiple words together and separate the words either using an underscore or perhaps by having each initial letter in the word with a capital letter capitalized. And that's a technique called camel casing, because it's sort of the different capital letters look like the humps of a camel, so it's sort of where that name's come from. It's a little bit silly, but it's a good way to remember it, and it's a good technique you can use sometimes in your variable names. So just to be aware of some variable names, here's a list of a few variable names. Some of these are legal, allowed to be used. Some of them are illegal, not allowed to be used. So the first one, so as we go through them, what do you think? My variable 1, does that conform to all of the rules that we just learnt about? Yes, it does. It starts with a letter, there's no spaces, it's got a number in it, but it's on the end, so that's allowed, so that's fine. The second one, underscore first name. Yep, that's allowed too. That meets all the requirements. It starts with an underscore. It's a bit funny looking, but that's allowed. You're allowed to do that. As opposed to the third one, your name. It's got all the characters in it that it's allowed to have, but the problem is it starts with a number. So that means it's illegal. You're not allowed to use that. The next one, pay rate. Bit of a problem there. It's got a space, so we're not allowed to use that because of that space. You cannot have spaces in your variable names. And the last one, pay rate for job. So it's pretty long. It's probably too long really, but that doesn't mean that it's illegal. That's perfectly fine to use, and it's a really good example of the camel casing technique that's been used, that's been implemented. So with those things in mind, let's go and have a look at some of the things that we need for Module 1 of our GROK Learning course. So here we have some code where we've got something funny looking called MSG, and it's got equals, hi there, and then we're printing something, and in brackets we've got that MSG. Okay, let's say if we understand that code a little bit. Well, MSG is just a name of a variable. Often programmers will shorten their variable names. MSG is a common abbreviation that might stand for message. Okay, so we often do that, so we keep our code a little bit shorter, but you could quite easily call that, use the whole word message for that variable. And what we're saying is that the variable message is equal to the value hi there. So what we are doing is storing that value inside our variable bucket that we've named message, MSG. Okay, so we're just saying we've got a variable and we're putting a value inside that variable. Print is a command. Okay, the important thing about that variable is it's what we call a string variable, which is text. We'll talk a bit more about those in a little bit. But when we've got text being stored inside a variable, we need to enclose that inside quotes. Single quotes or double quotes doesn't actually matter, but we need to enclose it in quotes because it's text. We're then using a command. The purple thing there is a command, and you'll see these different colours in the GROK Learning interface when we get into having a look at that. The print command means print something on the screen, display it on the screen. What is it that we want to display on the screen? Well, we want to display whatever it is that is currently sitting inside of our MSG, our message variable. Because at the moment, that's the text, hi there. That's what's going to be output and printed on the screen. Okay, so it's a bit of program code, pretty simple program code, creating a variable, putting something inside the variable, and then displaying the value of that variable on the screen. Okay, and that's a really common thing that we do when we're working with and using variables. Next thing is sometimes we might want to get our variable from the user. Okay, so we've got a variable being created here called name. And what we're saying is that name is equal to input, that's in purple, so that's a command. And after that, we've got in brackets, what is your name? The input command is the way that we ask the user for the value of a variable. We're asking the user, what is your name? And we're going to take the input that they give us, the answer that they give us, and store that inside a variable called name. And then we're just going to display the value of that name variable. So if the computer asks you that question and you put in your name might be Francis, then the computer is just going, the value of the name variable is going to be Francis, if that's what you put in, and the program is then going to print out the, Francis, because that's the current value of your name variable. Okay, so we've got name as our variable. Input is a command that allows us to request input from the user. Inside the brackets is the question that we ask the user, and then we output the value that the user has provided. So that is a really common thing that we do in programming all the time in getting input from the user, and you'll see a number of problems that ask you to or require you to do that. Something we need to be aware of as well is the fact that we've got different types of data that we might want to store inside of variables. In our examples just before, we had variables with text inside of them, and we know now that we have to enclose those inside quotes. That is what's called a string or text data. Okay, they must be in quotes. We've seen all those, but not all of our data is in the form of text. Sometimes we want to use numbers, and we call that numeric data. Okay, numeric data are typically numbers that we want to be able to use in calculations. You might want to store numbers but don't have to use them in a calculation. It's okay to store those as a string. But if you want to be able to use your numbers in a calculation of some type, like a mathematical sum, then you don't put those values inside quotes. We don't use quotes for numbers, and that's how we differentiate numeric data from string data. The third type that we'll see at different times is what's called Boolean data. So that's a bit of a funny term, but that's data where you only have one of two possible options. For example, a true or a false, a yes or a no, an on or an off, and it can't be anything else. It has to be one of those two values, and we call that Boolean data. So it's important to have an understanding of the three different types of data that you might see, because we work with them a little bit differently in our programs. For example, if we want to have a program that joins some string values together, this is how we can do that. So here we've got a variable called first name, and that's got a value of Harry. And we've got a variable called last name, and that's currently got a value of Potter. And if we print first name plus last name, what do you think is going to happen here? What's our output going to be? Well, yeah, our output is going to take those two variable values and it's going to join them together. But what's the problem? If you have a look at the output, yeah, Harry Potter has got no space between it. That's not how we write a name normally. So the point here is you need to be aware when you're using strings and joining things together that spaces is something that you as the programmer need to be mindful of, and you need to include those things in your code if you want them to be presented correctly. So what you actually would need to do in that case is print first name plus an empty set of quotes with a space in them, so that we get that space in our output, and then your last name variable, and that will give us a correctly formatted bit of output. That's it.